Hi Tanya, you have some nice images in your series, and where you included the before and after, I've doubled them up like this so that we can show both. There's definitely a little problem with your series in that you used a pinhole lens on top of glass optics, and that's pretty characteristic when we see the heavy vignetting like this. And so even had you not mentioned that in your essay, it would have been pretty clear what was going on there. It definitely can be used for a fun effect, but it's not a true pinhole lens when you do that. Basically, you are causing a diffraction error through the glass optics, and it gives, in a way, a similar sort of approach, or excuse me, a similar sort of aesthetic, but what we see is, our images actually have much more detail than you would ever get with a true pinhole lens. We also see much more likely to get this kind of a lens flare when the light comes in through the pinhole and kind of diffuses out over the glass lens. That's definitely a characteristic of this kind of approach, and this is a little bit outside the scope of the assignment. Looking through your images, you certainly have some nice ones. I want to make sure all of your afters are turned on here, and including your portrait. However, they don't fit together necessarily as a cohesive theme. They stand as more a series of individual photos. You have a couple of flowers in here, and certainly that could have been the start of a cohesive series. But then you added in some trees, which, yeah, kind of related, wine, which definitely not related, and the self-portrait definitely not related. And so for your next photo project, I want you to think about how your images will fit together as a cohesive whole. Certainly, once you do a little bit of editing, especially for images that are a little dark to begin with, we start to see some digital noise. And one of the ways that we might deal with that in Photoshop is using the camera raw filter. Now, before you do that, it's almost always best to turn your layer into a smart object. And so you can see the big difference here is that we get this little icon, whereas we don't for a regular layer. Once you have that converted, do the camera raw filter, and then come to this detail tab, which looks like two little triangles. Now what we see here is mostly color noise, and I always turn off the sharpening before I begin, because that just kind of confuses things, or can confuse things. We call this color noise because it's mostly red, green, and blue pixels. We maybe have a little bit of luminance noise here towards the shadows. That's going to come across as black or white or gray pixels. But definitely the primary noise is a color noise. And so these things work by just moving up the slider a little bit. And you can see once we start to address some of the color noise, then it becomes more obvious, oh yeah, there is some luminance noise too. And frankly, it's pretty uncommon to only have one or the other. And so very often you need to work both of these in combination. Luminance detail, luminance contrast. For the sake of this class, I'd say experiment with it a little bit. I don't really want to go into it, but basically the detail slider is going to protect detail in it, so you can see if you go all the way over, we're bringing back the noise, whereas if you go all the way to the left, we really smooth out an image. Generally speaking, I use this one around 50, and then maybe or maybe not I'll use the contrast, or down here the color smoothness. But we'll kind of see how that looks. Once you dial in appropriate settings for your noise reduction, then you can maybe add a little bit of sharpening back in, and I always start off with the amount and just kind of bring it up a little bit. And I like to keep these values very low. I usually keep detail as 0. For a low res image like this, radius is definitely as low as you can go, which is 0.5. And then I like to add in a little bit of masking. So basically what we have is the skin tones are supposed to be nice and smooth, so we wouldn't expect to see any sharpening there. But what we do want to see is like eyelashes, for example. The background that we have here in your blinds, those would be appropriate to do. And the masking is really the way to do that. You can just kind of slide it up and see what happens. And sorry about those flashes. Every time I try to do this kind of thing when I've got the video recording going, it kind of flakes out a little bit. But the key to using masking on the sharpening is to hold on the Alt key or the Option key, and then you get this kind of false image, and you dial it in to just where you want it. So you can see even at 70% we're introducing a little bit of sharpening artifacts to your skin. We don't want that at all. And so we can kind of come all the way up, maybe a little bit on the edge of the nose, just because we will get some detail from the the contrast that we get here from the brightest part of your nose to your cheek. And so that's what that represents. Certainly the eye, we want to see that, and we can see some nice detail in the blinds. And so we can see how that looks before and after. And you can see that makes a very big difference for a pretty quick edit. Overall, I think you have some nice compositions. I think you have some nice thoughts about lighting, and certainly some nice thoughts about your subject matter. The big thing is that your approach with your lens combined with the glass optics is a little bit outside the scope of the project, and it's an important distinction. As you look through some of your classmates' work, you'll be able to see the difference between a true pinhole without any lenses in there, and there are a few assignments that have the same sort of approach. And it's just a very different aesthetic. Let me know if you have any questions.